The manicured lawns and meticulously trimmed hedges of Meadowbrook Estates, a seemingly idyllic suburban community, concealed a darker reality, a simmering undercurrent of fear and resentment. Victoria Pruitt, the newly elected president of the Meadowbrook Homeowners Association, had wasted no time in consolidating her power and imposing her twisted vision of community standards on her unsuspecting neighbors. And her latest target was the most vulnerable residents of Meadowbrook, those with disabilities. It began subtly with a series of seemingly innocuous changes to the HOA bylaws. New architectural guidelines were introduced, requiring all exterior modifications to homes to be approved by a newly formed aesthetics committee, chaired, of course, by Victoria herself. Then came the parking regulations, restricting the types of vehicles allowed within the community, and finally the community enhancement fees, ostensibly for landscaping and maintenance, but with suspiciously high surcharges for certain non-standard features. But these changes, cloaked in the language of community improvement, were nothing more than a thinly veiled attack on residents with disabilities. Sarah Miller, a vibrant young woman who used a wheelchair after a car accident, was one of the first to feel the sting of Victoria's discriminatory policies. She received a notice from the HOA informing her that the ramp she'd had installed to access her front door, a ramp that was fully compliant with the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, was now subject to a special assessment fee, a fee that was triple the standard HOA dues. The reason? The ramp, according to Victoria, detracted from the aesthetic uniformity of the street. Then there was Mr. Henderson, a retired veteran who relied on a specially equipped van to get around. He received a violation notice stating that his van, clearly marked with handicap placards, was considered a commercial vehicle and therefore prohibited from being parked overnight within the community. The solution offered by Victoria. He could park it in a designated visitor lot, located over a mile away from his home. The complaints piled up. A woman with a visual impairment was fined for having unsightly tactile paving stones installed on her walkway. A family with a child with autism was threatened with eviction for the noise generated by their son's therapeutic swing set. A senior citizen with mobility issues was told that his walker was cluttering the common areas. Victoria's actions weren't just insensitive, they were illegal. They were blatant violations of the Fair Housing Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act. But Victoria didn't care about the law. She cared about control. She cared about creating her own twisted version of suburban utopia, a place where everyone conformed to her narrow ableist standards. And she was willing to use the HOA as her weapon, wielding its power to harass, intimidate, and ultimately displace anyone who didn't fit her mold. The residents of Meadowbrook were beginning to realize that they were not just dealing with a difficult HOA president. They were dealing with a bully, a bigot, and a tyrant, determined to make their lives a living hell, and the battle for the soul of their community was just beginning. David, a retired history professor and a new resident of Meadowbrook Estates, had initially dismissed the HOA's petty rules and Victoria's overbearing personality as mere annoyances. He'd lived in communities with strict HOAs before, and he'd learned to navigate the bureaucratic minefields with a mixture of patience and quiet defiance. But something about Victoria's recent actions, her blatant targeting of residents with disabilities, felt different. It wasn't just about enforcing rules, it was about something more sinister, something deeply unsettling. The final straw came when he saw Karen taking pictures of his neighbor Sarah Miller's house, the one with the newly installed wheelchair ramp. He'd seen Karen lurking around other homes as well, always with her phone in hand, always with that same smug, calculating expression on her face. Then he overheard a phone conversation. was walking his dog past Karen's house one evening when he heard her voice, raised in anger, coming from her open window. "I don't care what it takes," she was saying. "Get them out. They're dragging down property values. Find a way, any way, to make them leave." David stopped, his blood running cold. He knew instinctively that she wasn't talking about overgrown lawns or unapproved flower pots. She was talking about people. She was talking about his neighbors. He decided to do some digging. He started with the HOA's records, poring over meeting minutes, financial statements, and correspondence. He found a pattern of escalating fines, increasingly restrictive rules, and a disproportionate number of complaints filed against residents with disabilities. He then enlisted the help of his aunt, Eleanor, a retired paralegal with a sharp mind and a knack for uncovering hidden information. Eleanor, confined to a wheelchair herself after a stroke, took on the task with a fierce determination. "That woman is a menace, David," she declared after reviewing the HOA documents, "and I'm going to help you expose her." Eleanor's research uncovered a treasure trove of damning information. She discovered that Victoria had been sued multiple times for housing discrimination in other communities where she'd lived, always settling out of court and moving on to a new target. But the most shocking discovery came when Eleanor delved into Victoria's financial records. She found that Victoria owned a real estate company, Pruitt Properties, that specialized in buying and flipping homes. And, more importantly, she found a direct correlation between the homes of residents with disabilities who had been forced out of Meadowbrook and the properties subsequently purchased and resold by Pruitt Properties, always at a significant profit. The puzzle pieces were falling into place. Victoria wasn't just a power-hungry HOA president. She was a con artist, a predator, using her position to systematically target vulnerable residents, force them out of their homes, and then profit from their misfortune. David and Eleanor continued to gather evidence, meticulously documenting their findings. They obtained recordings of Karen's phone calls, secured copies of internal emails from Pruitt Properties discussing problem properties and relocation strategies, and collected sworn statements from former residents of other communities who had been victimized by Karen's schemes. They had built a strong case, a mountain of evidence that exposed Karen's cruelty, her greed, and her blatant disregard for the law. Now it was time to take action, to bring her down, and to restore justice to Meadowbrook Estates. The quiet retirement community was about to become a battleground, and David and Eleanor were ready for war. The walls were closing in on Victoria, and she knew it. The whispers, the rumors, the growing sense of unease among the residents of Meadowbrook, it all pointed to one thing. Someone was investigating her. Someone was uncovering her secrets. She suspected David, the retired history professor, with his quiet demeanor and his persistent questions. He was always lurking around, always observing, always asking the wrong questions. And then there was his aunt, Eleanor, that wheelchair-bound busybody who seemed to spend her days poring over HOA documents. Victoria decided she needed to act quickly to silence the dissent, to destroy any evidence that might incriminate her. She started with Elena. One rainy evening, under the cover of darkness, Victoria snuck into Eleanor's garage, where the elderly woman stored her meticulously organized files. She grabbed boxes of documents, HOA records, legal papers, anything that might contain information about her activities. She dragged the boxes outside into the pouring rain and dumped them onto the driveway, leaving them to be soaked and ruined by the storm. She felt a surge of satisfaction as she watched the rain fall, washing away the ink, turning the paper to pulp. She was erasing the evidence, silencing her critics, destroying any trace of her wrongdoing. The next day, she ramped up her intimidation tactics. She issued a new round of violation notices, targeting anyone she suspected of siding with David or questioning her authority. She fined residents for having unapproved doormats, for leaving their garage doors open for too long, for having bird feeders that attracted unwanted wildlife. She even threatened to tow a resident's car because it was parked too close to the curb. She also contacted her lawyer, a slick, high-priced attorney who specialized in bullying tactics and legal loopholes. She instructed him to send threatening letters to David, Eleanor, and anyone else she suspected of being involved in the conspiracy against her. She wanted to scare them, to silence them, to make them back down. But Victoria had made a fatal mistake. She had underestimated her opponents. She had assumed that David was just a meddling old professor, that Eleanor was just a frail, helpless old woman, that the other residents were too afraid to challenge her. She had failed to do her homework. She had failed to realize that Eleanor wasn't just a retired paralegal. She was a retired federal judge, a judge with a distinguished career, a reputation for integrity, and a network of powerful connections within the legal system. A judge who knew the law inside and out, and who was not afraid to use it to fight for justice. Victoria's attempt to destroy the evidence, to intimidate her opponents, to silence the dissent, had only served to strengthen their resolve, to solidify their alliance, and to provide them with even more ammunition against her. She had thought she was being clever, that she was covering her tracks, but in reality, she was digging her own grave. One soggy document, one threatening letter, one miscalculated move at a time. She had picked a fight with the wrong people, and she was about to learn a very painful lesson about the consequences of underestimating your enemies. The Meadowbrook Estates community room had never seen a meeting like this. Every seat was filled, every inch of standing room was occupied, and the air crackled with anticipation, with a palpable sense of righteous anger, and with the intoxicating scent of impending justice. This wasn't just an HOA meeting, it was a revolution. David and Eleanor, armed with a mountain of evidence and backed by a community that had finally found its voice, stood at the front of the room, facing a visibly shaken Victoria. The other HOA board members, sensing the shift in power, sat silently, their faces a mixture of fear and apprehension. "Tonight," David began, his voice amplified by the room's sound system, "we are here to expose the truth about Victoria Pruitt, the truth about her corrupt practices, and the truth about the systematic discrimination that has plagued our community for far too long." Eleanor, sitting beside him in her wheelchair, her eyes sharp and unwavering, took over. She presented the evidence, piece by piece, building a devastating case against Victoria. She showed the recordings of Karen's phone calls, revealing her plans to force out residents with disabilities. She displayed the internal emails from Pruitt Properties outlining their strategy to acquire the homes at below-market prices. She presented the sworn statements from former residents of other communities, detailing Karen's history of discrimination and predatory practices. She then played the security camera footage of Karen dumping Eleanor's documents, adding malicious destruction of documents to the list. The audience gasped, murmured, and shook their heads in disbelief. They had suspected Karen was difficult, that she was overzealous, that she was a bully, but they had never imagined the depth of her corruption, the sheer cruelty of her actions. Then it was the residents' turn. One by one they stood up and shared their stories. Sarah Miller, the young woman in the wheelchair, spoke of the exorbitant fees Karen had imposed on her ramp. Mr. Henderson recounted the humiliation of being forced to park his van a mile from his home. Others told of being fined for trivial violations, of being harassed and intimidated, of being made to feel like second-class citizens in their own community. The stories were heartbreaking, infuriating, and utterly damning. They painted a picture of a woman consumed by greed and prejudice, a woman who had abused her power to enrich herself at the expense of her neighbors. Just as the meeting reached its crescendo, a group of men and women in suits entered the room. They were federal agents from the Department of Justice and the Department of Housing and Urban Development. They carried with them boxes of documents, additional evidence of Karen's wrongdoing. One of the agents stepped forward. "Victoria Pruitt," he announced, his voice clear and authoritative, "you are under investigation for multiple violations of federal law, including the Fair Housing Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and numerous counts of fraud and conspiracy." The room erupted in applause. Karen, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror, tried to protest, to deny, to deflect, but it was no use. Her reign of terror was over. The HOA board, acting swiftly to distance themselves from the scandal, immediately voted to remove Karen from her position as president. The vote was unanimous. She was stripped of her power, her authority, her control. She was, in that moment, nothing more than a disgraced former resident, facing a mountain of legal and financial troubles. The community she had sought to dominate had risen up and cast her out, rejecting her prejudice, her greed, and her tyranny. The victory was sweet, the justice profound, and the message clear. Even the most powerful bullies can be defeated when a community unites to fight for what's right. The disintegration of Victoria Pruitt's life was swift and complete. The HOA meeting had been a public execution, a stripping away of her power and prestige, but the legal and financial consequences that followed were even more devastating. The federal investigation, triggered by Eleanor's connections and fueled by the mountain of evidence David and Eleanor had compiled, moved with remarkable speed. The Department of Justice, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and even the FBI were involved. Their combined resources focused on dismantling Karen's corrupt empire. Pruitt Properties, Karen's real estate company, was immediately targeted. Its assets were frozen, its bank accounts seized, its operations shut down. The investigators discovered a complex web of shell corporations, offshore accounts, and fraudulent transactions, all designed to conceal Karen's illegal profits. Karen's real estate broker's license, her livelihood, her source of income, was suspended pending a formal review. The evidence of her discriminatory practices, her predatory lending, her blatant disregard for the law was overwhelming. She would never sell another house again. The fines began to pile up, each one a crushing blow to her already shattered finances. The Department of Housing and Urban Development imposed a massive fine for her violations of the Fair Housing Act. The Department of Justice levied penalties for her fraudulent business practices. The state added its own fines for her violations of real estate regulations. The total, when it was all added up, was staggering, hundreds of thousands of dollars, far more than she could ever hope to repay. She was financially ruined, her carefully constructed empire reduced to rubble. Throughout it all, Karen maintained a defiant, almost delusional facade of innocence. She ranted and raved, she threatened lawsuits, she blamed everyone but herself. She accused David of orchestrating a witch hunt, Eleanor of using her connections to persecute her, the residents of Oak Haven of being ungrateful and disloyal. She even threatened to sue the federal government, claiming that the investigation was a politically motivated attack on her First Amendment rights. Her threats were empty, pathetic, the last gasps of a drowning woman. The final crushing blow came during a meeting with her lawyer, a hastily hired public defender who replaced the high-priced attorney she could no longer afford. The lawyer informed her in blunt, uncompromising terms that her case was hopeless, that the evidence against her was overwhelming, and that she faced a significant prison sentence. It was then, and only then, that the reality of her situation finally seemed to penetrate her thick skull. She broke down, sobbing uncontrollably, her carefully constructed facade of arrogance and entitlement crumbling before her eyes. Eleanor, who had been present at the meeting at the request of the prosecution, watched Karen's meltdown with a mixture of pity and satisfaction. She had no desire to see Karen suffer, but she also believed in justice, in accountability, in the principle that actions have consequences. As Karen was being led away, she turned to Eleanor, her eyes filled with a mixture of rage and despair. "You think you've won," she spat, her voice shaking with emotion. "But I'll get you. I'll get you all. I have connections, you know. I know people." Eleanor smiled, a calm, knowing smile that cut through Karen's bluster like a knife. "Actually, Karen," she said, her voice soft but firm, "I have a few connections myself. 28 years on the federal bench tends to have that effect. I have friends in places you wouldn't dream of." Karen stared at her, her eyes widening in disbelief. The full weight of Eleanor's influence, the power of her network, the sheer impossibility of her situation finally dawned on her. She had picked a fight with the wrong woman, the wrong family, the wrong community, and she had lost utterly and completely. The departure of Victoria Pruitt from Meadowbrook Estates was not a cause for celebration, but for quiet reflection and determined rebuilding. The community, scarred by her divisive tactics and predatory practices, had a long road to recovery, but they were united in their commitment to creating a better, more inclusive, more just neighborhood. The HOA, under new leadership, immediately set about dismantling Karen's legacy. The discriminatory rules and regulations were repealed, replaced by a new set of bylaws that explicitly protected the rights of residents with disabilities and promoted diversity and inclusion. The Aesthetics Committee was disbanded, its arbitrary power dissolved. The community enhancement fees, with their hidden surcharges, were abolished, replaced by a fair and transparent system of dues. An invitation was extended to all former residents who had been forced out of their homes by Karen's actions, offering them the opportunity to return to Meadowbrook, to reclaim their place in the community. Some accepted, eager to rebuild their lives in the place they had once called home. Others had moved on, their wounds too deep to heal, their trust in the neighborhood irrevocably broken. But for those who remained, and for those who chose to return, a new spirit of cooperation and understanding began to emerge. They organized community events, potlucks, and block parties designed to foster connections and build bridges between neighbors. They established a welcoming committee to greet new residents and ensure they felt included and supported. And, in a powerful symbol of their commitment to inclusivity, they organized the first annual Meadowbrook Abilities Fair, a celebration of diversity and a showcase of resources and support for residents with disabilities. The event featured adaptive sports demonstrations, information booths from local disability organizations, and a keynote speech by Eleanor, who shared her own experiences and emphasized the importance of creating a truly accessible and welcoming community for everyone. Karen, meanwhile, was forced to sell her house in Meadowbrook, the proceeds going towards the massive fines and restitution she owed. She left town in disgrace, her reputation ruined, her future uncertain. The family who moved into Karen's former house was, in a fitting twist of fate, a family with a young daughter who was a star athlete in the local Paralympic basketball league. The sight of the girl, confidently maneuvering her wheelchair up and down the driveway, practicing her shots in the warm afternoon sun, became a symbol of the new Meadowbrook, a community that embraced diversity, celebrated inclusion, and rejected the narrow, prejudiced vision of its former tyrant. The transformation of Meadowbrook was not instantaneous, nor was it perfect, but it was real, it was tangible, and it was enduring. The scars of Karen's reign would remain, a reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of vigilance. but they would also serve as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, the power of community, and the enduring promise of a better, more inclusive future, a future where everyone, regardless of their abilities, could find a place to call home, a place where they were valued, respected, and celebrated. This HOA story serves as a potent reminder that prejudice can manifest anywhere, even in seemingly benign settings like a homeowners association. It highlights the particular vulnerability of those with disabilities, who often face systemic barriers and discriminatory practices. As we age, many of us or our loved ones may experience disability, making this issue deeply personal. The narrative underscores the critical importance of active allyship. David and Eleanor's investigation, fueled by empathy and a commitment to justice, was crucial. It's a call to action. We must not be passive bystanders. We have a responsibility to speak out against injustice, to support those who are marginalized, and to use our accumulated experience to advocate for a more inclusive society. True community is built not on conformity, but on respect for individual differences and a shared commitment to protecting the rights of all. Furthermore, one must always question their unconscious bias.